You always question, why does IBM not launch anything new? Why did IBM not launch iPhones? Or like, why did IBM not build ChatGPT? They were ahead in AI, they were ahead in everything, right? It's because, in my opinion, there's like a bunch of teams looking to build a perfect product and too afraid to launch something.
So in today's episode, we're going to talk about something that is on all our minds, but we don't actively reference it because, Pritesh, this is the one thing that you and I both know is like a tug of war of how you build anything. And if the world is our oyster and we could build whatever we want and we had unlimited resources, then it's super interesting, right? We may never actually build anything because we have unlimited resources and unlimited time. And I think, I don't know how you think about this, but I feel like often when we can put a deadline on something or when we could put an outcome related to something, we have to work through some constraints or rules. I'm curious, as from just designing and building stuff, building product, building things that people use, how do you look at constraints, especially from a product development engineering side?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think everybody wants to build the perfect engineered product and the perfect usable product or the perfect full product, right? And what ends up happening is people will almost to their own, disadvantage, will want to build something that just solves everything and almost oversolves it. Sometimes constraints might be actually good because what it forces you to do is it forces you to say, okay, let's just make up a constraint. I have a constraint of like 20 days. I got to launch something in 20 days. That's a time constraint, right? And you say, okay, what can I do in 20 days? There's almost your first reaction to almost everything would be like that nothing can be done in 20 days. Well, that's not really true. Do something in 20 days. The question is it acceptable to your customer? So that's a time-based constraint, right? And in the engineering side, it becomes hard because I've almost 100% of the engineers that I worked with, when they look at someone else's code, they want to rewrite it. 100% of them. And it's not, and I think maybe 25 to 30% of the times, the code isn't bad that they want to replace. It's just that your neurons just don't work the same way someone else's neurons work, right? So sometimes it's bad code and people should rewrite it. But even then you have entropy constraints, right? Like you launch something and now people are morphing it into their own ideas, and all of a sudden you've got you've built a bunch of layers on top of it. Now you can't change it that quickly because you're going to break existing stuff. So that's another layer of constraints. So you've got time constraints, you've got maintenance constraints, you've got product vision constraints. How do you work through this, right? So typically we take a step back and we ask, okay, why are we doing this? And you should be able to answer that question fairly easily. Why are we doing this, right? As soon as we answer that question, I think things become a lot easier. Okay, so if that's why we are doing it, then what are we going to do to solve that problem? And what's the minimum things you have to do to solve that problem? And if that means that you're going to have to live with some, bad code, you're going to have to live with some bad code.
Yeah. You said something that I would love to kind of double click on and love to make sure that everyone learns from. But you glossed over it, which is, hey, what is the minimum thing you can build? And I think for drivers, for visionaries, the idea of a minimum thing that you can build is never an acceptable outcome. And so my question for you is, maybe someone designing product or an entrepreneur building a real estate company or a real estate agent or a team doing something themselves, give us your kind of guidance on the acceptance and the awareness and the comfort with doing, kind of minimum viable. Like, how do you show proof of concept? How do you show movement? Like, how do we get people comfortable with the idea of these Lego blocks and next steps? Because in a lot of ways, 5 minimum viable products are 5 different Lego blocks when you stack together can have something really powerful, right? So my question for you is, how do you get the world to get out of their own way and start to think about this minimum viable thing?
So, it's a good question. Let's think about the iPhone for a second, right? Today you have iPhone 15 or whatever, right? And I don't think when Apple launched the iPod, they would have thought that they would launch the iPhone. Like, I really just I don't know if there's proof around this, but for me, it's not conceivable to go from a device that has a circular part. I'm talking about the old iPod, the circular part, the very iconic, like, was cool. I actually have one, like, it's cool. In fact, I just plugged it into one of the devices I have because it has like local audio on it. But you wouldn't think that would lead eventually to the iPhone, which in my opinion, it did. In my opinion, what ended up happening is that became a full screen display because they wanted to make it cool. And they're like, hey, we should put a GSM on it and then go. So, and that's why you had the GSM devices first before it got to CDMA. But anyway, so the reason I bring this example up is like oftentimes when you're building the product, very few times like you would have something that like, 10 years in advance what you're going to build. Very few, right? Your best course of action is to put something in the market and then learn like what the market really wants and then refine it, right? So the concept of MVP, and like I made up this term and I was actually talking to the team yesterday called MAP. Like it's a made up term, like minimum viable product is something startups use to like say, let's just make the least possible product and just run to the market and see if people want to pay for this and use it, right? One or the other or both. A minimum acceptable product is technically where we are right now. Is you have a product market fit, you have customers using it, and their expectations are no longer here. This is the bottom, no longer here, it's here, right? You're still not above, like you're still not there. You're a growth company, so your expectations are like in the middle somewhere, right? But you can no longer do the MVP approach on a lot of things. Like you kind of have to polish it because you've got thousands of agents or thousands of customers using your product. You don't want to be like seeming like, okay, these guys are literally just experimenting on us. You want to get to a point where it's polished, but just enough. But like you can still keep the concept of an MVP is just like super polished now, but you're still doing the least amount possible, but it looks like it was still a product, right? So I would go with that approach and like that kind of, it's like the right balance. And I think beyond that, you always question, why does IBM not launch anything new? Like, why did IBM not launch iPhones? Or like, why did IBM not build ChatGPT? They were ahead in AI, they were ahead in everything, right? It's because, in my opinion, there's like a bunch of teams looking to build a perfect product and too afraid to launch something.
So I'll tell you this, as you were sharing that, I want to give people a very specific understanding of this MVP, MAP discussion. And I think you'll appreciate this because you and I have not actually talked about this. And one of my most favorite things that can happen in a business, especially in something like ours, is when you take a business solution and then you get stuck, and then a product solution comes and solves that entire business solution. So I'll give you an example, right? Most people know that we, in 2023, I had this vision and this idea to do private label. And I really wanted to do private label. I said, hey, we're going to go do private label, which means that we have 900,000 plus independent agents in the country, 100,000 plus independents. We got to give them a home because I used to run an independent before. And I was like, hey, wouldn't it be amazing if I could have my independent join Real? And so I shared this with the team, and the team was like, well, there's too much to do in this business solution. So I was like, all right, I agreed with the team. And a lot of times you have to negotiate with your own team because you want a complete buy-in for everything that you're working on. So we agreed with the team that we were going to do 5 pilot private labels. So we did 5 private labels in 5 different markets. And you were not privy to this, but I'll tell you the conversation you were privy to, right? So we did this 5 private labels. And so 5 independent real estate agencies joined Real. Well, all 5 of them had completely different business models. And so while the front end of the MVP solution, which is private label, made sense, they came in and it was not acceptable because they now had to take their existing economic model and overlay it onto ours. And there was so much friction around it, which is when I shared with you and I was like, hey man, I think I have half the solution. So I have the private label stuff, but what I'm realizing is keeping your brand is not the only problem. All these brands, the power is not just the front end of the brand, but it's also the back end customization of their model. We need a way for them to port and integrate their model onto ours. So it's not just bolted on, you have to integrate their model onto ours. And you're like, wait a minute. So we need to have a clear software solution, a configuration that allows people to take their current economic model and integrate it onto ours. And you're like, you said to me, hey, 3 years ago, we'd have never been able to do this. I actually think we can build this out. And you gave me a timeline for that. But we knew very clearly what the minimum acceptable product was. I actually think, I'll share this with you. I was recently doing an interview and someone asked me, hey, so private label is not new. A lot of teams do private label and white label, etc. And I said, yes, anyone can do private label, but it will break because it broke for us. And I used this analogy where I said, private label is like an uncooked steak without proteins. You can have a great piece of, a Kobe beef, which is what private label is. Good job offering that. And you always call it a feature. It's a feature, but that feature has it has a requirement for the second Lego block, which is the proteins, which is why I feel super fortunate that we were able to take a business MVP idea in private label and then say, oh my gosh, we can bring a product solution to it. But the crazy part is, Pritesh, if we did not do private label, we probably would have never done proteins.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. The only reason to do proteins was going to be the vision of like, hey, you can walk into any independent indie brokerage and say, move over to Rio, nothing changes for you. And we're maybe one use case away from achieving that dream, right? But it's a great example of like a minimum acceptable product, right? We didn't launch something and say, oh, we can't support most use cases. We could, in fact, the opposite. We could support most use cases, and then came like the corner cases, right? And like Proteins 1.1 would be an example of like, now you learn from the market and you build only what you need to build. Instead of sitting in a lab, keep building something and be too afraid to like launch something and then realize that everything you built is actually useless.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this question. A lot of times companies that have moats, right? They've built something over time and they have, whether you look at it that way or not, it is so many Lego blocks that are built in place. And now I would love for you to talk about this. A lot of times you can say, oh, well, realize 5 Lego blocks and it's going to take the competition, 3 years to catch up. And I actually don't believe that's true because it's not a linear time of catching up. I think that time to catch up is exponential because the sequencing of what you build and the sequencing of learnings and the sequencing of human capital associated with it and the sequencing of market adoption and there's so many things that have to happen for the Lego blocks to actually come to life. So my question for you is this: could you talk about why it's hard for people to catch up? Like you talked about catching up with Zillow. It's like really hard to catch up with Zillow, not because we can't build the product that they have built. There's so many other nuances, Lego blocks that they have in place that it's going to be hard for us to do. So my question is around the same MVP, MAP idea, which is it's easy to think that catching up is a linear process, but I don't think it is. How do you think about it?
Well, I think like catching up is 2 ways. One is you say, hey, we know point A and we know point B and we need to get to point B. And there are 2 ways to get to it. One is just copy your competitor, right? You say they've solved the problem, just copy paste, download the app, let's just rip the whole thing, right? And 2 is like you say, I'm going to do it my own way. There are pros and cons to both. The pro of copy pasting your competitor is because the risk goes down. You just have the execution risk on it, right? The con is you don't know what you don't know. What I mean by that is your competitor has a bunch of bad decisions that they made along the way, including us. Like we've made some bad decisions. We have our internal plan to course correct, but that's not advertised. So when people are copy pasting your stuff, they're copy pasting your mistakes, right? And that compounds even more because by the time they catch up to 3 years of mistakes, there are 2 more years of mistakes that you're going to copy paste, and you're just like copy pasting mistakes. The other side is you say, okay, I know point A to point B. I know the business really well. We're going to do our own unique thing. In that case, you need a talent pool. You need the talent pool, and you need executives who are not going to quit. Because those people are the ones who are responsible to make sure that the plan from A to B is executed over 5 years. So you don't want like these career executives that are just switching, right? So that's one. And then once you have that, then you got to build a talent pool out. And then you hope that your plan is right. And like this industry is plagued with like launched plans and failed and launched plans and failed because the business is so freaking complex. And like thousands of regulations and thousands of, requirements and audits and this and that, like that you have to build, that you almost have to be OCD about the problem to like really, really fix it. Right.
Yeah. I have this, I've been doing this thing over kind of the last 10 years. One of my early coaches taught me this. I haven't shared this with you. And she said, "Hey, Sharran, you gotta." So I have, for those that know me, I have like a high D personality. Like for me, I drive, and for high D personalities, like most salespeople, most drivers, most builders, we don't do well if we don't have continuous dopamine hits. And so it's cool to like build something and realize the result in 6 years. But if I don't get small wins along the way, like even when we have wins and I share it with you and Thamir, right? Like that's a dopamine hit for me, because if I don't share that, like I feel like I'm working in isolation and I don't really have any success. And so the more it's the stacking of the Lego blocks and the dopamine hits over time. And I share this for one very specific reason, is that I built this idea called the 52 needle mover system. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I realized that if I could take one idea, one minimum acceptable product on a weekly basis, I could then at the end of the year look back and said, man, I built 52 little Lego blocks. And the hardest part for me was the diligence of sitting there and building this. In a way, what I did is I made 52 sprints in my life, right? That's what I did. And so I would love for you to kind of share this idea of, you've worked in different environments. You've worked on, 1 week sprints, 2 week sprints, 3 week sprints, month sprints, break up on teams. You've done all of those. Could you just talk about how to use like a burst of effort to get a burst of result?
Yeah, as the company at Real, let's just talk about Real, right? At Real, as the company grew, we had to change our ways, because the team went from like 4 people to, hundreds now. And with more scale, you get to a point where you don't even sometimes know like names, unfortunately, and sometimes projects that are going on that are not the top projects in your mind. So we've gotten to a point where our sprints and our delivery cycles are all predictable and like are going. Personally, what I've gotten to, like your example of 52, I have 365 times 3. I'll explain what that is. So I wake up every morning, and by 10 a.m. that morning, I've done the essential meetings and like my own internalization of like priorities, and I decide 3 things I'm going to do today, no matter what. Like it's a no matter what thing. So what ends up happening is, like, because it's a no matter what thing, you end up picking 3 things you can realistically do and are also the most important things in your opinion at that time. Assuming the rest of your process just works, you pick those 3 things and you just go at it. And you become annoying for the people impacted by those 3 things. But at the end of the day, almost always you get them done and you're making solid progress because you decided at the beginning that those are the 3 most important things today, right? So I end up doing that, and that works for me. It's like that leaves my to-dos in control, leaves my inbox to 0, leaves my process alone, and you don't change everything. And like you kind of trust your process and you trust your own system. My system is 3 things a day. No more complex than that. And if you can't remember what's the most 3 important things today, you have a different problem.
Yeah. So hopefully this was helpful for people. I think what we really wanted to get to was this idea of constraints, and doing something better than MVP. I think a lot of people have thrown around this MVP word a lot, but doing something better than MVP, which forces us to say, hey, the thing better than MVP is actually the MAP, which is not just a minimum viable product, but a minimum acceptable product. No matter what you do, maybe 3 things a day, maybe a marketing campaign you're delivering, or maybe a product you're building. Ask this bigger question: what is the minimum acceptable product?